Hello, my friends. We enter 2026 with the international system continuing its steady descent into managed chaos. The Western Bloc remains trapped in outdated illusions of dominance, while realities on the ground relentlessly contradict the narratives sold to their own publics. From the very first days of the new year, a sequence of events has exposed once again how Western political and media systems operate. Deny inconvenient facts, shift definitions when necessary, and protect at all costs the covert role of the United States, particularly the CIA in its proxy war against Russia. The situation in Iran is a case in point. Protests driven by inflation, currency weakness, and rising living costs are immediately framed in Western discourse as the beginning of regime collapse. The usual voices reappear, confidently predicting regime change. This is a recycled fantasy. Iran has endured decades of sanctions, sabotage, and economic warfare. Internal economic strain does not equate to imminent political collapse, regardless of how desperately Western commentators want to believe otherwise. Far more significant are the events surrounding the drone attacks in the vicinity of President Vladimir Putin's residence. Russia's Ministry of Defense released comprehensive evidence, flight route maps, technical specifications, warhead details, video footage of intercepted drones, and eyewitness accounts. By any objective military or intelligence standard, this constituted a complete evidentiary package. The Western response was immediate and reflexive denial. Figures such as Kaja Kallas dismissed everything as distraction, insisting Russia was fabricating the incident to derail peace. No analysis of the evidence was required. No verification was attempted. The logic was simple and ideological. If Russia says it, it must be false. What followed was a coordinated media campaign. The Wall Street Journal led with claims that the CIA had found no evidence that Ukraine targeted Putin's residence. Yet the article simultaneously acknowledged that drones were indeed sent into the region. The explanation offered was that the drones were allegedly aimed at a different military facility, one previously struck, without naming it, locating it, or explaining why such basic information could not be disclosed. This narrative collapses under minimal scrutiny. If the target had been struck before, secrecy makes no sense. The New York Post echoed the same line, then escalated further by arguing that Russia's claims proved Moscow does not want peace and that additional sanctions and escalation were required. President Trump's decision to repost this article on Truth Social was troubling, signaling once again how easily he can be pulled into narratives hostile to Russia. The New York Times soon followed, declaring that the CIA had rebutted Russia's claims and had briefed Trump accordingly. According to the Times, Putin's residence was not targeted, and the drones were supposedly aimed elsewhere. But here is where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Within hours, the same newspaper published a lengthy investigative piece openly admitting that the CIA is actively assisting Ukraine in conducting drone strikes against Russian oil facilities and tankers. This is the critical point. While denying Russian claims of targeted attacks, the Western media simultaneously acknowledged that the CIA is directly involved in enabling strategic strikes on Russian infrastructure. This is no longer speculation. It is an admission. That New York Times investigation, based on over 300 interviews, portrays chaos and factionalism within the U.S. government. Trump is depicted as lacking ideological commitment, shaping policy based on the last person he speaks to, what he sees on Fox News, and how respected he feels by foreign leaders. This portrayal is designed to weaken Trump politically, but it also inadvertently reveals the deeper reality. U.S. Ukraine policy is increasingly driven not by elected leadership, but by intelligence agencies and entrenched bureaucratic factions. According to the article, CIA analysts identified Achilles heel components in Russia's refining infrastructure complex systems difficult to repair quickly. Targeting these facilities, the article claims, cost Russia approximately $75 million per day and supposedly gives Washington leverage over Moscow. This claim does not withstand serious economic or strategic analysis. For a country with Russia's scale, resources, and wartime economy, such losses are not decisive. They do not force capitulation, nor do they alter Russia's core objectives. What they do reveal is the desperation of Western planners searching for leverage where none meaningfully exists. More revealing is the moral double standard. As Ukrainian drone strikes killed civilians in Russian-controlled Kherson during New Year celebrations, Western media showed little interest. There was no outrage, no urgent calls for investigation, no emotional headlines. Russian civilian lives simply do not register within the Western moral framework. At the same time, Europe continues its self-destructive trajectory. Bulgaria's entry into the Eurozone against popular opposition and amid political instability was celebrated by European elites while ordinary Bulgarians brace for higher prices and declining purchasing power. This pattern is familiar, monetary integration benefiting financial centers at the expense of peripheral populations. New Year messages from Western leaders only reinforced how detached they have become from their own societies. Macron spoke of protecting Ukraine, not France. German leadership urged citizens to ignore fearmongers, while German industry continues to collapse under energy costs and deindustrialization. The head of the European Commission spoke of innovation and democracy, yet devoted her message almost entirely to Ukraine as if Europe itself were now secondary. The conclusion is unavoidable. The West no longer controls its own narrative. It denies evidence when inconvenient, admits uncomfortable truths when forced, and relies on information overload to obscure the central reality. This is not a war between Russia and Ukraine alone. It is a proxy war directed, sustained, and escalated by the United States and NATO, with the CIA playing a central operational role. Russia, by contrast, has acted with strategic consistency, grounded in concrete security interests and battlefield realities. Western attempts to distort, deny, or manipulate perceptions only further expose the truth they are trying to hide. As 2026 unfolds, that truth will become increasingly difficult to suppress. To understand what is truly unfolding, one must step back from daily headlines and examine the structural dynamics driving Western behavior. What we are witnessing is not merely policy confusion or media dishonesty. It is the manifestation of a system that can no longer reconcile its declared values with its operational realities. The United States and its NATO partners are trapped in a contradiction of their own making. They insist publicly that they seek peace, stability, and a negotiated settlement. Yet privately and operationally, they pursue escalation mechanisms designed to weaken Russia incrementally. This dual-track approach, talk peace, wage war, cannot be sustained indefinitely. It erodes credibility, not only with adversaries, but with neutral states observing from the outside. The CIA's role in this process is not accidental. Intelligence agencies thrive in environments of ambiguity and perpetual conflict. A frozen war, a prolonged proxy struggle, or a low-intensity but continuous confrontation justifies budgets, authority, and political relevance. A genuine peace settlement, by contrast, threatens institutional interests. This is why intelligence agencies so often become de facto policymakers in times of prolonged crisis. In Ukraine, this dynamic is especially pronounced. The Ukrainian state, militarily dependent and economically exhausted, no longer functions as an autonomous strategic actor. It is a platform used, guided, and sustained by external powers. Decisions about escalation, target selection, and strategic messaging are increasingly made outside Kyiv. Ukraine executes, Washington designs. From Moscow's perspective, this reality is not theoretical, it is operationally obvious. Russian planners understand that they are not negotiating with Ukraine, nor even primarily with European capitals. They are dealing with the American national security apparatus, fractured as it may be, between elected officials, intelligence agencies, and ideological factions. This is why Russian responses are calibrated, patient, and strategically restrained. Despite provocation, Moscow has avoided actions that would hand Washington a clear pretext for direct NATO involvement. Instead, Russia has steadily degraded Ukrainian military capacity, expanded defensive depth, and integrated newly secured territories into its administrative and economic systems. These are not the actions of a state acting impulsively. They are the actions of a state preparing for long-term strategic endurance. Western analysts consistently misinterpret this restraint as weakness. It is not. It is discipline. Equally misunderstood is Russia's economic resilience. Western policymakers continue to assess Russia through models designed for liberal market economies deeply integrated into Western financial systems. Russia is neither structurally dependent on Western capital nor psychologically bound to Western approval. Sanctions have accelerated internal adaptation, redirected trade flows, and strengthened economic ties with non-Western partners. The result is not collapse, but transformation. This is precisely what terrifies Western elites. A Russia that survives sanctions, absorbs pressure, and emerges structurally altered but intact represents a catastrophic failure of the post-Cold War coercive model. It signals to the rest of the world that Western economic warfare is survivable, and that lesson will not be forgotten in Beijing, Tehran, New Delhi, or Brasilia. The information domain reveals the same decay. Western media no longer functions as an investigative institution. It operates as a narrative enforcement mechanism. Stories are framed not to inform, but to constrain acceptable conclusions. Facts are selectively acknowledged, then contextualized into irrelevance. Contradictions are not resolved. They are drowned in volume. Yet even this system is fraying. The admission, however, inadvertent that the CIA is directly enabling attacks on Russian energy infrastructure shatters the illusion of American neutrality. It exposes the war for what it is, an undeclared, indirect conflict between nuclear-armed powers. That reality cannot be permanently concealed, no matter how aggressively language is managed. Europe, meanwhile, is paying the price for strategic subordination, deindustrialization, energy insecurity, and political fragmentation are not side effects, they are outcomes. European leaders speak of sovereignty while surrendering it daily. They speak of democracy while overriding public opposition. They speak of peace while preparing for indefinite confrontation. This is not leadership. It is inertia disguised as moral purpose. The deeper tragedy is that Western societies are being prepared slowly, subtly for permanent instability. Lower living standards are normalized, militarization is reframed as virtue, dissent is pathologized. The public is conditioned to accept that endless conflict is the natural state of affairs rather than the result of specific policy choices. Russia, by contrast, operates from a different civilizational logic. It does not seek validation from Western institutions that have already declared it illegitimate. It seeks security, strategic depth, and recognition of its red lines. These are not maximalist demands. They are foundational requirements for any great power. The failure of the West lies not in its inability to defeat Russia militarily, but in its refusal to accept geopolitical reality. The unipolar moment is over. No amount of drone strikes, sanctions packages, or media choreography will resurrect it. As 2026 advances, the question is no longer whether Western narratives will collapse, they already are. The question is how much damage will be done before reality is finally acknowledged. And when that moment comes, it will not be Russia scrambling to adapt. It will be the West forced at last to confront the consequences of its own illusions. At the military level, the Western misunderstanding of Russia is profound and persistent. NATO planners continue to evaluate Russian behavior through a doctrinal lens shaped by expeditionary wars against weak states, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, conflicts where air supremacy, technological shock, and narrative dominance substituted for strategic coherence. Russia is not fighting that kind of war, and it never was. Russia's campaign reflects a classical continental strategy: attrition, depth, logistics, dominance, and control of escalation. The objective has never been theatrical breakthroughs designed for media consumption. It has been the systematic erosion of Ukraine's manpower, industrial base, energy infrastructure, and command and control capacity. Time, not tempo, is the decisive variable. Western commentators obsess over symbolic targets and daily maps. Russian planners focus on force regeneration cycles, ammunition burn rates, training pipelines, and demographic sustainability. This asymmetry of focus explains much of the West's analytical failure. They mistake patience for hesitation and restraint for incapacity. Drone warfare illustrates this perfectly. In Western discourse, drones are framed as game changers, capable of reversing battlefield realities through technological cleverness. In reality, drones are tools, useful, disruptive, but not decisive in isolation. Russia has absorbed drone attacks, adapted air defenses, dispersed logistics, and hardened infrastructure. The net effect is tactical friction, not strategic reversal. This is why the CIA's emphasis on energy infrastructure strikes is revealing. It signals an admission that Ukraine cannot win militarily in conventional terms. Instead, the strategy shifts toward economic harassment, hoping cumulative irritation will translate into political pressure. That logic mirrors earlier sanctions thinking, which has already failed. What Western strategists refuse to confront is that Russia's political system is not structured around short-term economic comfort. It is structured around state continuity, sovereignty, and historical endurance. Pain does not automatically produce compliance. In many cases, it produces consolidation. This brings us to the psychological dimension of the conflict. Western elites operate within a framework of moral narcissism. They assume that their values are universal, their interpretations definitive, and their judgments final. When confronted with resistance, they interpret it not as rational disagreement, but as pathology, authoritarianism, disinformation, or malign influence. Russia rejects this premise entirely. It does not seek moral approval from Western institutions it regards as compromised and hypocritical. It seeks recognition of power realities. That is an irreconcilable difference. The result is strategic dialogue at cross purposes. When the West speaks of rules-based order, Russia hears selective enforcement and arbitrary punishment. When Russia speaks of security guarantees and red lines, the West hears excuses for aggression. There is no shared conceptual vocabulary, and without that, diplomacy becomes theater. This is why negotiations repeatedly fail, not because compromise is impossible, but because the West approaches talks as instruments of delay and pressure, not resolution. Agreements are viewed as tactical pauses, not binding settlements. Russia has learned this lesson the hard way over decades, from NATO expansion to Minsk to energy agreements quietly abandoned when inconvenient. Trust, once destroyed, does not regenerate on command. Another critical element often ignored is the role of the global South. While Western media frames the conflict as a global moral crusade, most of the world sees something very different: a power struggle between established hegemony and emerging multipolarity. Sanctions fatigue is real. So is skepticism toward Western claims of altruism. Countries across Asia, Africa, and Latin America are watching carefully. They see how economic coercion is weaponized, how financial systems are politicized, and how narratives are enforced. Russia's survival and adaptation under pressure serves as a case study. It demonstrates that alternatives exist, even if imperfect. This is the true strategic nightmare for Washington. Not a Russian tank column in Europe, but the normalization of defiance. A world in which states no longer assume Western dictates are unavoidable is a world fundamentally different from the one the U dominated after 1991. Europe's predicament is particularly tragic. By subordinating its strategic autonomy to Washington, it has sacrificed energy security, industrial competitiveness, and diplomatic flexibility. European leaders speak endlessly of values, yet their populations bear the material costs of policies they did not choose and cannot influence. The social consequences are already visible. Political fragmentation, rising extremism, declining trust in institutions. These are not temporary disturbances. They are structural stresses. Meanwhile, Western militarization of discourse continues. War is normalized as a permanent condition. Defense spending becomes sacred. Questioning strategy is framed as disloyalty. This is not confidence. It is insecurity institutionalized. Russia, conversely, approaches the future with a long historical memory. It understands cycles of rise and decline. It understands that empires overextend not through lack of power, but through misjudgment of limits. Its strategy is not to defeat the West outright, but to outlast its illusions. And illusions are precisely what sustain Western policy today. The illusion of narrative control, of economic omnipotence, of moral infallibility, of escalation without consequence. These illusions can persist longer than expected, but they always end. As 2026 progresses, the strategic trajectory is clear. The West will continue to deny the nature of the conflict, even as its own actions confirm it. Russia will continue to consolidate gains, absorb pressure, and prepare for a post-Western equilibrium. When the reckoning finally arrives, it will not be announced with headlines or summits. It will manifest quietly in policy reversals, in tacit admissions, in exhausted publics no longer willing to pay for fantasies. History rarely ends with dramatic collapse. More often, it ends with the slow, undeniable recognition that a world has changed and that those who refuse to see it have fallen behind.